Du Fu climbing the tower. Flowers by the high tower hurt the visitor's heart. Troubles are everywhere as I climb up to look down. Spring colors along Brocade River bring heaven to earth. Floating clouds on Jade Fort Mountain blend then and now. The court, like the northern star, in the end remains fixed. May the Tibetans west in the mountains cease their raiding. Even the pathetic second ruler still has his temple. At the end of this day, I will make a Liang Fu song. So, yet another poem by Du Fu. This poem is similar to the previous one in that it depicts a climbing, but this is specifically climbing a human structure, climbing a tower. We've already encountered many poems about climbing towers. I think we've already encountered some by Du Fu himself. So I'm not going to repeat myself, but remember, elevating oneself physically, like in climbing a high structure, and the expansion of gaze that this produces is generally equated with an expansion of insight, with knowledge. It's not only that the poet from the height of the tower can see the landscape better, he can also reflect philosophically and see with the mind's eye what is true, what is immovable, what is, philosophically relevant beyond ephemeral interests and petty objectives of everyday human life. As opposed to the previous one, this does really feel like the typical Du Fu poem because of the way in which it blends personal and national grief. In fact, there's no indication of personal, physical, or other sort of grief here, but we do get national grief contrasted with the beauty of nature. And this is a juxtaposition that also appears in many Chinese poets. This is related to what I have talked many times, Chinese correlative thought, the idea that nature has to ring with human society and that bad things in human society lead to natural disasters and vice versa. Yeah. So, a little bit of a context. This poem is written, from what I've checked in another translation, in 764. Du Fu is in the area of Shu, the modern province of Sichuan. And there's been pretty much, a chaotic situation which is reflected in the poem. So the An Lushan rebellion had finished, but the country in the aftermath of the An Lushan rebellion didn't really recover, at least not for the first decades or so. The northern Yellow River Plain, where most of the population and resources were located, had been massively devastated by the warfare. The capitals had been sacked, some of them repeatedly, especially Luoyang. Um, Even though nominally the empire was at peace, the area in the north and in the east of the empire was de facto ruled by military warlords who had been the ones that had led the rebellion. They paid lip service to the emperor now, but in all but name, they were independent rulers of their military domains. And there was a threat from the West, mainly coming from, well, from the Uyghurs, but even more than from them, from the Tibetans. The Tibetans had already been a thorn in the side of the Tang Empire, even during its moments of highest power and glory. The unification of China and its prosperity under the Tang is contemporary to the unification of Tibet, forming a strong and aggressive empire. In the year 763, in fact, the Tibetan Empire had campaigned against China. They had managed to take the capital, Chang'an, which was pretty close to the western border. The Emperor Daizong had had to run away, and the Tibetans had even placed a puppet Tang emperor in the throne. A year later, at the time Du Fu was composing this poem in 764, the capital had been recovered, but the Tibetans were still causing grief, especially in what had been the western regions and in big parts of Shu, of Sichuan. So, in this situation of semi-permanent crisis in national grief, Du Fu is making an outing. He's climbing a tower, which is not specified, but which probably would have been a tower in the walls of Chengdu, probably the main city of Shu. From that tower, he can see landmarks that will be described in the second couplet. That is the Brocade River, which is one of the affluents of the River Min, and the Jade Fort Mountain, which is a mountain to the west, in the mountainous area to the west of Shu. Brocade River. Remember the city of Chengdu, I think we've mentioned it. It was called the Brocade City because already from the Western Han Dynasty onwards, it had a very important brocade producing trade. Yeah, so the Brocade River was called so because it was believed that the makers of brocade washed those clothes on that river. Topics of the poem. We already mentioned them. So insight into the current national crisis, lamentation, antithetical contrast between the renewal and beauty of spring and the happiness that spring generally entails, as opposed to the grief, to the political grief that Du Fu is feeling because of the national catastrophes that keep piling up on top of the dynasty, and yet hope at the end that the dynasty has just overcome the occupation of the capital and it will keep overcoming. And there's also the typical element of wishing to serve, which is very obliquely referenced to in the last line of this couplet. In the last line of the poem, in the 8th line in the last couplet. Okay, then, so as usual, let's take a look at the poem couplet by couplet. First pair. Flowers by the high tower hurt the visitor's heart. Troubles are everywhere as I climb up to look down. So the poem begins, the poem is climbing the tower, so the poem begins with the poet actually doing that action, climbing the tower, which would have been one of the cultural pastimes and entertainments that scholar officials would engage in their free time, climbing famous towers and enjoying sightseeing and maybe having a drinking party or some poetry reading with friends at the top of the tower. No such occasion of happiness and partying do we have here. There's no indication that Du Fu is with anybody else. So he's climbing the tower, but he's not in a good mood, and the first line very clearly reflects that. So it's spring, the tower is surrounded by flowers, which would have been probably a beautiful and enjoyable sight. But the visitor's heart is not moved by spring, it's moved by national grief. So the flowers by the high tower actually hurt him. They don't transmit to him any happiness. They just make him sad, melancholy. He is pretty indifferent to the beauty of the flowers because the country is in chaos. The second line emphasizes this, although it's pretty unspecific about what the national grief is. It says, troubles are everywhere as I climb up to look down. So the poet is, in spite of his outing and his landscape viewing, is not able to extricate his heart from the problems of society. Nature is not strong enough to take him away from society. He is a Confucian after all. He's not a Taoist. Second couplet. So the second couplet, in spite of these misgivings and these feelings of grief that Du Fu is experiencing, in the second couplet we do actually get a description of the lovely nature in spring that is seen from the top of the tower, and we get this mystical communion with nature which seems to neutralize, if only for a couple of lines, the worries and preoccupations that are in Du Fu's mind. Spring colors along Brocade River bring heaven to earth. Floating clouds on Jade Fort Mountain blend then and now. So we get this lovely vision of nature which synthesizes different sights, different spaces, and different times. So it's spring. The spring colors are along the Brocade River. So next to the river, we might imagine the trees are flowering. There's greenery. There's the different pinks and yellows and reds and whatever other colors on a background of green that brings spring with it. So beautiful, so brocaded appear the shores of the Brocade River that it seems as if heaven had been brought down to earth. So we have a beautiful landscape, a beautiful natural brocade, which makes honor and which rhymes with the Brocade River's own name. And beyond the waters looking a little bit up to the heavens, there are multicolored clouds floating around the mountains, especially the tip of Jade Fort Mountain to the west. And here the image, apart from being beautiful, no, so is a chronological one. So these floating clouds blend then and now. During a period of time in which Du Fu is looking at the landscape, the clouds keep on blending and moving. Yeah. So there's this image of natural, physical location of beauty, but also it's a chronotope also. Through the passage of time, this natural beauty keeps flowing. The clouds keep on moving. There might be an undertone in the floating clouds that is pointing towards the scholar official himself. Remember, retired scholar officials, hermits, are very typically represented metaphorically in Chinese poetry as floating clouds on top of mountains. Third couplet, and we go back to the national problems. The court, like the North Star, in the end remains fixed. May the Tibetans west in the mountains cease their raiding. So the third couplet is the more explicit about those troubles that have been taking place. And the troubles have apparently been surmounted. Again, I insist this poem was probably written in 764, 1 year after the occupation of the capital, and the capital has been recovered and Emperor Daizong has gotten back into it. So the court, like the Northern Star, in the end remains fixed. In spite of all the troubles, the court is still the court, and the dynasty still manages to keep a hold on the empire. The equation of the emperor and the court with the Northern Star is very typical. So just as all stars in the Northern Hemisphere seem to move around an unmoving polar star, Polaris, so all the people seem, in the Chinese ideal, seem to gravitate around a fixed, stable imperial court. One would doubt this stability and power, especially at times of dynastic failure, but it seems the dynasty has just had a little stumble. It's not going to collapse yet. In fact, the second line, emphasizes this more through wishful thinking than through actual evidence. May the Tibetans west in the mountains cease their raiding. There is the wish for the conflict with the Tibetans to come true, and this, in this case, we would have a wish come true. This was a true wish fulfillment because the Tibetan Empire, shortly after these events, in the end of the 8th century, actually split up and never reunited again and stopped being forever a threat to the Chinese. But of course, Du Fu had no way of knowing this at the time composing this poem. He's only hoping for an end to all the chaos and warfare that has come about the country for the last 25 years, ever since the An Lushan Rebellion. Finally, the last couplet synthesizes, as usual, the message and the desires of this poem, the national crisis that seems to be averted, or that Du Fu wishes will be averted, and which will lead to no further damage. And this is done through an exemplar from the past, and also through a wish for service in Du Fu, and this line can be taken, the last couplet, as very oblique criticism of the current Emperor Daizong. Even the pathetic second ruler still has his temple. At the end of this day, I will make a Liang Fu song. So the pathetic second ruler refers to the successor of Liu Bei, who had been the founder, if you remember, we talked about this in other poems, of one of the three kingdoms at the end of the Han. He had founded Shu Han in the west, in the area of Shu, and he was, related to the Han imperial house. He and his great general Zhuge Liang managed to carve out a kingdom for the Han dynasty, a loyal remnant. It didn't last long, though, even though it was successful against the far superior forces of Cao Wei and Eastern Wu during the first emperors, during Liu Bei's reign and during Zhuge Liang's chancellorship. His son was, a useless, pleasure-seeking fool, and he was an incompetent ruler, but he was still lucky because his good minister, Zhuge Liang, still managed to preserve his state for him, at least as long as Zhuge Liang remained alive. So he's saying, And you know, a shrine honoring the dead king still was still being kept in Chengdu. So Du Fu is telling us, you know, even this worthless ruler is still, you know, homaged, still has his shrine where sacrifices are made to him. So even though he was a bad ruler, he could still mobilize the capital, you could say, the political social clout that had been created by his father and his chancellor to keep on the throne. So you know, you can read this pretty explicitly as a criticism of Daizong, saying, you know, you might not be a too competent ruler. You have been expelled from the capital by these barbarians, but you know, you're still a member of the Tang dynasty, and there's still enough glory and cultural capital and power for the dynasty to probably continue with certain degree of success in the following years. And he was right in this. And he concludes, at the end of this day, I will make a Liang Fu song. A Liang Fu song was a type of ballad, I think, a military ballad in the style of the Yue Fu poems that were typically sung. So maybe Du Fu is here saying, you know, I will just climb the tower and sing a song, one of these ballads of yore. But there is also another, you know, undertone connecting to the region of Shu, in which Du Fu is, and connecting to Du Fu's political ambitions. So Zhuge Liang, the chancellor of whom we've talked a minute ago, while he was in retirement and before Liu Bei managed to recruit him for his empire building purposes, was famed for reciting, for singing the Liang Fu song. So perhaps Du Fu is, you know, in using this image, is clearly pointing out, I wish to serve like Zhuge Liang and to restore the glories of the dynasty. At least that's my fantasy, whether it is a realistic desire, which it's not at all, or not. So quite a nice poem, quite an interesting poem. You know, much richer than the previous one, Climbing High, we read the previous day, and you know, very typically in the style of Du Fu, in his mastery of parallelism in a long 7-syllable line, and in his merging, you know, national grief with personal grief and with nature.